Hello, I'm Jeffrey Sachs, university professor at Columbia University and president of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I'm profoundly honored to be included in this wonderful symposium on civilization of goodness, altruism, harmony, and sustainability, just what the world needs. And I'm delighted to speak on the topic of toward a global ethic, ancient wisdom for modern challenges. Now, I believe that the greatest challenge of our time is our mindset, is living together. And ethics is the body of knowledge of how to live a good life. And that's true for us as individuals in our personal ethics, and it's true of our politics and our interstate relations as well. Ethics is the field that should help to guide us to think about how we can survive and thrive in the 21st century. Now, the idea that ancient wisdom can help us to face our very modern, even cutting edge technological challenges will not be a strange idea to the wonderful co-hosts of this symposium. Suu uh, Compassionate Relief Organization is a globally renowned organization, unique for bringing Buddhist wisdom all over the world, 130 countries, I understand, in bringing compassion, uh, humanitarian help, education, and reflections on a better life throughout the world. So that is ancient wisdom for modern challenges. The Tang Prize, of which I'm a very, very lucky and grateful recipient of the Tang Prize for Sustainable Development, is another exemplar of ancient wisdom for modern challenges. Why the Tang Prize? Because the Tang Dynasty exhibited the combination of innovation, social justice, and sustainable progress that is the very purpose of the Tang Prize. Makes me tingle, especially as a recipient, this wonderful, innovative prize, and it's drawing upon the ancient wisdom of the Tang Dynasty. And the Club of Rome is a third sponsor or host of this symposium. And the Club of Rome is a remarkable organization that started with the business leaders in Italy, uh, scholars, scientists who came together many decades ago, more than 50 years ago, because they realized that Earth was facing something unprecedented, the crisis of a world economy that was expanding at an exponential rate and putting absolutely unprecedented pressures on our finite Earth. And for me, the Club of Rome played a very particular role in my own intellectual uh, life because it was the first book that I was assigned as a freshman at a first year student at Harvard College in 1972, a new book called Limits to Growth, which was the great pioneering works promoted by the Club of Rome to understand how ecological risks could lead to what was called an overshooting of the Earth's carrying capacity. And that fundamental text and idea set us on the course that we now call sustainable development. That is combining human material progress and social justice with a sustainable management of our finite planet. So maybe I don't have to say all that much more because if we look at the ancient wisdom that Suu Kyi charity draws upon, the Tang Prize, and the Club of Rome, Rome, the eternal city of Western civilization, the city in which the uh, greatness of 3,000 years nearly of continuous development is on view in the magnificence of Rome, and that is an inspiration for Italy's business leaders that gave rise to the Club of Rome. So perhaps I could stop there, but I'm going to try to add something to Suchi, Tang, and Club of Rome. And I want to come to what I regard as the most harrowing of all of the challenges that we face on our planet. And one could think of many great challenges. Of course, the environmental challenges are profound, complex, urgent. Of course, the challenge of continuing extreme poverty in the midst of a world of wealth is startling and urgent, especially because it's so solvable. Of course, the challenge of growing inequalities of income and wealth and power is another uh, tremendous challenge that we face. But I believe that the greatest challenge of all, the most urgent challenge of all, is the challenge of our survival in the nuclear age, and indeed in an age where the technologies being harnessed for destruction are so powerful, so overwhelming, that humanity is walking at the brink, walking at a cliffside where a misstep, a mistake, a misinterpretation, uh, a, uh, a dangerous and deranged leader could tip the world into a spiral of essentially suicidal proportions or mass genocidal proportions. So I believe that the greatest challenge that we face, because it's fundamental for everything else we want and need to do, is to survive and avoid conflict among the major powers of the planet. And this is where I want to look to ancient wisdom to give us some guidance for our challenges today. Now, let me say at the outset that I believe we need a global ethic of statecraft so that the great powers, including the United States, Russia, China, India, Europe, and I think the African Union will become a great power in the course of the 21st century, can live together, even more, can thrive together, and can avoid the kinds of conflicts that could end civilization. Now, let me point out that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has been in existence almost for 80 years since the birth of the atomic age, since the dropping of the atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has been warning humanity for just about every bit of those 80 years of how close we are to nuclear war and to nuclear suicide. In 1947, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists unveiled a graphic, the Doomsday Clock, which they used to help the broad global public to understand the extent of the urgency and danger that we face in the nuclear age. And when they unveiled the clock in 1947, they said that the minute hand was a mere 7 minutes to midnight. What they were signaling to the world is how close we are to nuclear annihilation by deliberate choice or by absolutely horrific, nearly unimaginable mistake of miscalculation or even weapon systems that go completely awry. The minute hand has moved closer to midnight and farther from midnight, depending on the state of the relations of the nuclear superpowers. During the Cold War, the minute hand moved closer to midnight, sometimes coming as close as 3 minutes to midnight. Then in the 1970s and 1980s, it moved away from midnight because there was a kind of détente or rapprochement between the United States and the Soviet Union. And when President Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union and not only preached but practiced disarmament, even unilaterally disbanding the Soviet military alliance called the Warsaw Pact, the minute hand moved even farther away from midnight. In 1992, when the Soviet Union ended and became 15 successor states, each one independent and sovereign, the minute hand was set by the atomic scientists at 17 minutes away from midnight. Still a dire risk, but the farthest from nuclear war that it had been since the clock was unveiled in 1947. But ladies and gentlemen, my main point is that since 1992, we have moved relentlessly, horrendously, terrifyingly closer to midnight without respite. Every U.S. president since 1992 came into office with the minute hand farther from midnight and left with the minute hand closer to midnight. That's true of Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump 1, Biden, and I think it's sad to say, quite possibly going to be true of Trump 2, if we avoid disaster. It still could mean that the risks multiply. We are now at a mere 89 seconds to midnight, less than a minute and a half, according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. We are perched on the verge of nuclear war. And the bulletin has added that clearly the ecological catastrophes multiply the risks gravely. Now, the point that I want to make is that I believe that the reason we have come so close to disaster is the mindset, especially of my own country, the United States, and a mindset that the United States leaders have that they inherited from the British Empire, because the British Empire dominated in the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, and then the American Empire has dominated from the end of World War II until today, though now we all understand we are in a truly multipolar world, not a US-led world, but a multipolar world with all the increased risks that that shift has entailed. So what is the mindset of the British and the Americans, the so-called Anglo-Saxon world? It is a mindset that says that conflict is inevitable, that great powers necessarily compete and with a certain possibility or probability fall into open, hot conflict. This is a mindset called realism in international relations. And it is taken to be a basic feature of reality, true for all civilizations and at all times. But my argument is this is not correct. This is really an Anglo-Saxon view. The world need not be seen as endless conflict. The Chinese perspective on statecraft is completely different, as is China's history about statecraft. And I believe that even the British ideas, which have been around for a few centuries, don't reflect the true ancient wisdom of Western civilization. So let me try to explain briefly my point. British philosophers from Thomas Hobbes onward viewed human beings as necessarily conflictual. Remember that Thomas Hobbes, the author of the Leviathan, in the middle of the 17th century, declared that in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And what he said was that human beings are so insatiable in their desires, so implacable in their competition, that they hit up against each other because of their ambitions for power, for fame, for wealth. They conflict, and he said, in a state of nature, to the point of even killing each other. And so Hobbes said we need an overarching authority, a Leviathan was the point of his book, in order to stop people from killing each other. It's a very dark view of human nature. But in the British mind and in British empiricist philosophy from Hobbes onward, the idea is that individuals have their preferences and they compete with other individuals, and they need to be prevented from therefore openly attacking those other individuals, whether by a government that enforces the rules and keeps people from killing each other, or a government that defends private property rights, as the philosopher John Locke emphasized. But the clash of individuals is taken to be the basis of how we live. And this idea has permeated the Anglo-Saxon thought. When carried to statecraft, the idea is that nations, like individuals, necessarily compete, necessarily clash, necessarily fight for their fame, for their glory, for their power, for their dominance over others. And in international relations theory of the realist or Anglo-Saxon variety, this is sometimes called the tragedy of great power politics, the name given by the great political scientist in the United States, John Mearsheimer, to the state of affairs of great powers. He says that great powers fall into conflict, and therefore they are almost trapped in an iron cage. And the result, according to Professor Mearsheimer, a dear friend and a very wise scholar, is a tragedy. Now, my point that I want to emphasize is we can do better than British empiricism. We can do better than Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And our ancient wisdom in the Western world, unlike the ancient wisdom of Confucius or the Buddha, in the ancient Western world, we can turn to Greek philosophers, and notably to my favorite philosopher, Aristotle, of course, who was the student of his teacher, the great philosopher Plato, who in turn was the student of his teacher, the great philosopher Socrates. But I want to turn to Aristotle briefly, because I think that Aristotle's basic wisdom can help us to find a global ethic. Aristotle did not hold that people were incorrigible, that human nature was necessarily conflictual. He said it's possible that that's the way, but he said people and city-states, countries in essence, can develop virtues or excellences of behavior, so that with those excellences, they live well and prosperously as social animals. In other words, as people aggregating in society and city-states living among other city-states. Aristotle emphasized many virtues, many excellences of character, but four became the central theme. One was practical wisdom. Use your brain, your wisdom, to judge properly how to behave. Don't react to emotion and instinct, but use your reason and wisdom. Second is the norm of justice, that we should each understand that to each is what is due, should be given, and that defines a society not in which people kill each other or steal from each other, but in which they can expect to receive what is due to them. The third is fortitude, to stand up for the truth, another virtue that Aristotle emphasized. And the fourth virtue that Aristotle emphasized is temperance or moderation. the idea to avoid the addictions to power, to wealth, to glory, to find a middle path, which is an idea very resonant with the Buddha, who also talked about the middle way, to avoid the excesses of asceticism or hedonism. And Aristotle felt exactly the same way, that moderation was the path to good behavior, to sociality. Now, what's very important about the ancient wisdom of Aristotle is that it also applied not only at the individual level, but at the level of politics. Aristotle's great treatise on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, was conjoined with the second volume, The Politics. And in fact, in those two volumes, Aristotle invented the science of ethics and the political sciences for the Western world. And he viewed politics as a field, a specialized field of ethics. Politics is the ethics of the political community, how the political community can develop its virtues so that it operates effectively at peace and promoting a good life for the people. Now, my point about global ethics is that when you listen to Aristotle and the idea of cultivating virtues and the idea that people can rise above their cruder emotions, what do I think immediately? I think what a wonderful conversation Aristotle and Confucius would have had on these points. I think that Aristotelian virtue ethics and Confucian virtue ethics have so much in common that they really provide the basis for a true global ethics. Think of the five virtues that Confucius taught: benevolence, that is Ren, or righteousness, Yi; propriety, Li; wisdom, Ji; and trustworthiness, Xin. Well, these resonate so closely with the virtues that Aristotle emphasized, the virtues of wisdom, the virtues of reciprocity, the virtues of moderation and propriety. The two would have had a wonderful time together. It's not that Confucius is exactly in the line of Aristotle. There are beautiful differences between the two, but they both believed in virtues and in cultivating virtues. They believed that education, that mentorship, that habit formation, that self-cultivation was the path to an individual's good life, and that virtuous leaders would inspire virtuous citizens, and that virtuous citizens in turn would demand and promote virtuous leaders. And of course, Mencius, coming a couple generations after Confucius, brought the political side to Confucian thought in very important ways. So the Confucian ethics and the Mencius ethics are a wonderful complement to the Aristotelian ethics. My view is that we can identify an ethics of statecraft that absolutely moves beyond the tragedy of great power politics. We can develop a statecraft and an understanding by leaders in China, the United States, and elsewhere of what proper ethical statecraft is in a way that can be cultivated and that could keep us away from midnight, that can put the minute hand of the doomsday clock farther from midnight. With virtue ethics, we can understand that clashes are not inevitable. We can understand what kinds of institutions we should choose in international relations to avoid even accidentally falling into conflict. I have proposed three precepts built on virtue ethics that I think can help to keep us safe. The first is that the great powers should not provoke or enter the near neighborhood of the other great powers, should not pose security threats to the other great powers. I strongly urge that China and Russia do not try to open a military base in the Western Hemisphere. This would absolutely be a horrific, uh, terrible decision that could lead to war with the United States. But at the same time, applying the golden rule, the United States should not have military bases in Ukraine. The United States should have known better not to push NATO enlargement to Ukraine right up against a 2,100-kilometer border with Russia. The Russians said, don't come to our border with your military. But the United States ignored that, even though the United States would never have accepted Russia doing the same. And that is a Confucian golden rule. Do not do to the other great power what you would not have that great power do to you. When it comes to Taiwan and China, the United States needs to step away prudently to stop making armaments and threats and unilateral declarations and not to trap Taiwan into the dreadful kind of mistake that the U.S. actually trapped Ukraine into. U.S. government officials told the Ukrainians, we have your back, we'll protect you, you do what you want. And of course, in that way, Ukraine became a battleground. We must have some space, some responsibility. China, the mainland, and Taiwan need to work out the issues between the two without the United States presuming to meddle in a way that it would never allow the People's Republic of China to meddle in the Western Hemisphere. And so I call this spheres of security. The great powers should not enter the neighborhoods of the other great powers because that can provoke the nuclear Armageddon. Second, major powers must be good neighbors to the smaller countries in their region. Being big is not a license to abuse. It is a responsibility for good neighborliness. At times, the United States has manifested that. During Franklin Roosevelt's term of president, he propounded a good neighbor policy towards Latin America. He told the Latin American leaders and the citizens, the United States will not intervene in your internal relations, still less militarily. But look at Donald Trump right now, threatening to invade Venezuela, threatening regime change. This is the opposite of a good neighbor policy. The third plank is a commitment to multilateralism under the UN Charter. The UN Charter is a charter of peace and international law. China subscribes to it. Russia subscribes to it. The United States helped to found the UN, in fact, more than any other country, but sometimes it doesn't subscribe to it anymore. And we need the UN Charter as the fundamental basis for international law in which all nations subscribe. So the 3 points, spheres of security where the great powers don't step on the toes of the other great powers. They stay clear. They let local issues be solved locally, not with great power meddling from abroad. Military bases should not be set up by great powers near to other great powers and so forth. Arms shipments should not go over the objections of major powers to neighbors of those major powers and so forth. The good neighbor policy for responsible management within the region and adherence to the norms of multilateralism. Let me just end by saying that with the Tang Prize and with the history of China, we can learn something very important. In Europe, war was persistent for hundreds and hundreds of years. Britain and France fought with each other. Then France and Germany fought with each other. Then Britain and Germany fought with each other. Wars were the absolute normal situation of Europe for 1,000 years with so much death, so much suffering, so much loss of population, so much destruction. But look at China as an example of what Confucian harmony could yield. From the beginning of the Ming Dynasty in 1368 until the arrival of the British in the Pearl River Delta at the opening of Britain's Opium War against China in 1839, there were almost no wars at all between China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. China never even tried to invade Japan. The Mongols did on a couple of occasions, but never the Chinese. The Chinese did not invade Korea. The Chinese had one short period of skirmish with the Vietnamese from 1410 to 1426 AD. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, you didn't have the realism of tragic conflict among the powers of East Asia. You had what historians call a Confucian peace. And this is where I would like to close. Confucius taught harmony. He taught that the virtues, when cultivated, can give harmony. And Confucianism proved its mettle. It proved that it works. It proved that statecraft for hundreds of years in East Asia could be peaceful. And I believe that that's what virtue ethics for the 21st century can accomplish as well. Western virtue ethics grounded in Aristotle and Confucian virtue ethics of East Asia, the Buddhist ethics of universal compassion, the Islamic ethics of justice and charity. We can build a common global ethics to transcend the pessimism of realism. We are not trapped by tragedy. We can do better than that. There's no guarantee we will. We must cultivate the best of humanity. As Mencius said, we have the sprouts of goodness. They must be cultivated. That, I believe, is the mission of Tzu Chi, of the Tang Prize, of the Club of Rome. It's why it's such a joy and honor to be with you. And it is why I believe that we can mobilize ancient wisdom for our modern challenges and build a truly global ethic. Thank you so much for the chance to participate in this wonderful symposium. Thank you very much.